I remember even as a high school kid learning about my sister. I have an older sister and her program. She went to the Brock University, and she did a major in history. Do we have any history fans in this group here? The odd one, okay. I remember thinking as a very sciencey high school kid, what on earth is she doing going to school for history? What does that lead to? What, you can work in a museum, maybe as a history teacher. And as she completed her degree, she did go off to teachers college, actually. I just remember thinking, wow, what kind of a degree is that? And yet, as I've grown older and gotten to experience the world a little more, I start to see that very famous, almost cliche saying by a famous philosopher, Harvard professor, that's on lots of plaques and is shared by Winston Churchill and many others. That famous saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Or maybe you're more familiar with, those that don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. We've been going through the book of Daniel today, and we are going to fast forward quite a few number of years from where we left off last week. We finished chapter 4 last week, and we really saw this powerful testimony of this long reigning evil king. But after many years of aggression and abuse and killing, God eventually got a hold of this king's heart. And so chapter 4, you can read this incredible chapter where he's basically expressing what God has shown him, how he's changed him, what he's revealed to him. We have this understanding in our day and age that the new thing is always the better thing. When I was in university, some of you probably can relate to this, and you went to buy your textbooks, you were told very specifically what it's called version, what edition you were supposed to have. And you could save $100 buying the older edition, or you could spend the $150 and get the new edition. And what did everyone tell you to do? Buy that new edition. You need the newest one. You need where we are today, even though a lot of the profs would tell you straight up that really they just changed the page numbers and that's about it. But there's this idea that in the past, our history is kind of like, it doesn't compare with what we can know now. Just forget the past, move forward to what's ahead. We're in this bigger and better place. And I even remember as a seminary student having that same experience. I'm going to grab a book here because I had a feeling, even in seminary, after finishing my bachelor's of science, that the past is kind of for the past, right? We live in the present. We're better now. We're looking forward. And so my focus, even in seminary, as I studied theology, was really on the modern day teachers, the modern day pastors, understanding what they think. And then my whole world was kind of shaken up in one of my first classes where they made me read this book, this very book. It's called Confessions by St. Augustine. St. Augustine was someone born in the 300s. And I remember reading this and being like, oh, this is like brutal. Like, it's hard to understand. It's hard to get through. But it didn't take many pages before I realized, wow, this guy is brilliant. And I started to learn from him and realize that what people dealt with in history is continuing to be dealt with today. The human condition hasn't changed. And people like this guy from the 300s has a lot to say into our problems today. What we're going to see today is a different king than Nebuchadnezzar, that's confronted with history and what God expects him to grasp from history. I'd encourage you to open up your Bibles to chapter 5. As I said, this is after the time of Nebuchadnezzar, but you'll see right the first word there. We've got a new king in town, King Belshazzar, not Belshazzar as Daniel's name was given. This is a different name, King Belshazzar. We know very little about him. This is really the bulk of what we know is found in the Bible, although there is extra biblical texts that now tell us about him. But just to give you the stage of what's happening, Nebuchadnezzar has passed away about 16 years prior to this. So King Nebuchadnezzar died. Daniel's still around. But then there's a kind of a tumultuous 6 years where there's 3 different kings that kind of go through and get taken out. And finally, one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons, I'm going to try and say his name, Nabonidus. So one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons takes over, and he actually holds on to the ruling for quite a while. For the first 6 years, he rules as any king does from the city of Babylon, but then there comes needs for him to be elsewhere, going to take more territory, stopping insurrections. So he actually leaves the city for a full decade. So the king has gone for a full decade, and when he left his son in charge. So if you're following with me, there's a king that's Nebuchadnezzar's son who's in charge. He leaves his son in charge, so the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar, who's passed away, and that is Belshazzar from our best understanding. That's who we're reading about in this case. And up to this point, he is given the title King Belshazzar because he's got all the authority of a king. He's been basically king for 10 years because it's been a decade that he's been in this position, and so people see him as the king. And that is where we're going to begin. We're going to do what I love to do is read through this passage slowly and take a break and talk about it. So let's read the first 4 verses together. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the kings and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of the God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. We read about this guy, and it's quite a contrast to the chapter just before, where we see this powerful testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, where the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar is basically having a huge party to impress his kingdom. He invites the lords, all those officials, 1,000 people to come and party with him. And he's in the position of authority. He's in front of all of them, just having a great time, drinking and showing that he is not afraid, that he is in charge. Now you can imagine in a kingdom that has been unstable as the Babylonians, with kings getting taken out and everything, and we know as we get to the end of the story, you'll know why, that there's probably a little bit of hints that Belshazzar has experienced that there might be something happening. There might be some insurrection, some rebellion that's starting to develop. So I think, from my understanding, he's having this party to basically nail down the fact that he is in charge, that his people are behind him, that they are a team, and that he is the boss. And he does that by demonstrating, he's going to drink freely in front of all his officers without a care in the world. He's really trying to establish how put together he is. He's fearless. He's ready. If anyone thinks they're going to come for him, they've got another thing coming. Unfortunately, I think a lot of us kind of give this same perspective, when we invite someone over to our house and we're eagerly cleaning the house, putting it together. We want to present the best way we can of ourselves, make them think that we have everything together. And that's really what Belshazzar is doing in this case. Even if there's these hints of an insurrection, he's going to state that he is fearless, he is not afraid, he is in charge. No one's going to tell him what to do. As we see, he's drinking wine freely, and verse 2 tells us that when he tasted the wine, he commanded that the vessels of gold and silver of the temple to be brought in, that him and his guests may drink of them. Now we know that the temple was leveled by King Nebuchadnezzar, and all of these very ceremonial, important vessels that the Jewish people used to worship their God were taken into Babylon. And yet he did something here that was very unusual for a Babylonian king to do. If you've been tracking with us, you'll know that Babylon, one of their ways of conquering was they'd level a city and then take all the useful people back and use them for building, for leading. And so it was unusual for someone in his position to basically mock and ridicule and make fun of another god, because not only could you upset their god, because the Babylonians believed in lots of gods, you could upset their god, but you're also going to create some strife with the very people that you've taken out. So the only reason that Belshazzar is doing this is really to nail down the fact that he is not afraid of anything. He doesn't care what has been done in the past. He is in charge. He's going to make the rules. And this is what he chooses to do. He brings out the vessels, he drinks from them. And not only does he use those vessels, but him and his group begin to praise the gods. Praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It's a clear act of defying the Jewish God and making a mockery of those that would claim to follow him. And recognize that this is the same God that his grandfather had given a clear testimony to in the chapter before. One side note that I think I need to state this, even though it's not the focus of this morning. We see this as, he was somewhat drunk and intoxicated in making this move. And even in our courts today, there is an idea that when you're drunk, you're not as responsible for your actions. But this guy was. We're going to see that God holds him completely accountable. He could say, I was really wasted. I didn't really know what I was doing. God holds him accountable for what he is doing. And that's just a little note that if you can relate to that, just know that in times of intoxication, you're not relieved of that responsibility, not in God's eyes. So as the party goes on, we can see that although this king's power did not meet Nebuchadnezzar's power, clearly his arrogance and his pride are far superior, far beyond what Nebuchadnezzar experienced. And as the party goes on, in enters a party crasher. Not just any party crasher, actually just the hand of a party crasher. Let's read verses. We'll read a little more, verses 5 to 16. So as they're drinking and praising the gods, these fake gods of gold and silver. Verse 5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed and his color changed and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing, make known to me the interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be third ruler in the kingdom. What we see from this party crasher, things take a direct 180. The king is initially hosting this event to really project his superiority over the situation, over his kingdom, and things drastically change. It's not a subtle statement. It's not like he just saw and saw this vision. This is a physical change that happens. There is actually writing. There's a hand that appears, and it says across from the lampstand. It is crystal clear that there is something here. It's not just a drunken haze. This is fact, that there is a change. There is something here writing on the wall, and everyone is terrified. So from this very prideful position of drinking in front of thousands of people and showing his fearlessness, we see in verse 6 that the color of the king changes, right? You've heard the expression white as a ghost, or white like you've seen a ghost, I guess. Physically, he's trying to present himself as this king that's got it all together, not afraid of anything. And this happens, and there's nothing he can do. Just physically, he is terrified. He goes from this bloated opinion to himself to having alarming thoughts. He goes from hoisting this cup of the temple that he is now in charge of, that he owns and he's going to use however he wants, to having his limbs give way. His fearless stance, as if he's ready to take on anyone that threatens him, transitions to his knees being knocked together. And we see a familiar scene, as we've seen in the book of Daniel a few times, where God shows up and all the wise men are called, and what happens? They can't figure it out. God has done something, shown something that all these people of worldly wisdom cannot figure out the answer to. The queen is the one that finally gives some decent counsel, and it should be noted here that the queen, likely this is the queen mother, if you read the footnotes, or possibly the queen grandmother. So it could be Nebuchadnezzar's wife, we're not sure. But someone who is not at this party is the one that comes in and gives some good counsel to this arrogant king. Where this king was looking to do away with history, to put himself on a pedestal, like, I am the future, this is how things are going to work. You're going to follow what I say. I am in charge. The best advice he gets is someone from the past, someone from the era that he's looking to do away with, to forget about. And she comes in and she gives him some probably maybe even concerning advice, where there's a guy that your father or grandfather, if we're understanding this in that way, is it found very wise. He had the wisdom of the gods. She's using the terms that Nebuchadnezzar himself used to express that there is someone that's capable of interpreting these things. And I wonder what went through Belshazzar's mind when he realized that this was one of those exiles of Judah, right? One of those Jews. After what he was just doing, you wonder, did he start to realize what he had just done? But nonetheless, he does take that queen's insight, and he calls, he's probably got nothing to lose. No one else can figure it out. So he calls this guy that's really a representation of his grandfather's rule. Up to now, it seems like Daniel, he hasn't been called. He's kind of gone into the background, probably purposely by the king. They're kind of pushing those kind of has-beens out of the way, and they're making room for their rule, for their kingdom. They're going to put their people in place. And so he has to go and figure out where this Daniel guy is and bring him in. And notice when he addresses Daniel, he does recognize that Nebuchadnezzar is the one that brought him. He recognizes that he's of the exiles of Judah. But notice that even in this statement to Daniel, I think the king is trying to hold on to some sort of control. Because he says, this is what's happened. No one can interpret it. I've heard that you can do this. And I'll tell you what, you do this, and I'm going to give you a gold chain and purple, and you're going to be third in the kingdom. Right? He's not approaching this in any way humbly. He's saying, look what I can do for you, Daniel. You help me out. Oh, I will help you out big time. There's still this sense of arrogance, of control that we see coming forward. Even though he's terrified of the situation, he refuses to give that up. He still wants control, and he is going to hold on to it. We can read This is where we really get to the meat of the passage, Daniel's answer. Let's read just to verse 21 first. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive, and whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he wills. Stop there for a moment, because we see here Daniel's offered this very generous gift by the king, and he outright says, keep it for yourself, give it to someone else. I don't need that. But what we do see Daniel does is, as he's done all throughout this book so far, he does his role. He is serving under the king, and he's willing to give this king what he's asking for, the interpretation. But before he does that, he goes through a little history lesson. And this is basically the Cole's Notes of chapter 4, right? You're seeing this theme. This Cole's Notes is basically, look, you know this King Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, as we best understand it, your grandfather, he ruled in such a way he could kill who he wanted, leave alive who he wanted, promote who he wanted, tear down whoever he wanted. He was in total control. You know his story, how there came a point where God, the Most High, humbled him. Before he gets to the writing itself, he highlights the facts of what Belshazzar already knows. And we see that as we read verse 22 and 23. It says, you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways you have not honored. Daniel is telling him, your actions are inexcusable. You knew what Nebuchadnezzar went through. Yes, he had incredible power. He was an incredibly evil man, and God humbled him, and he did not keep that to himself. Chapter 4 was a proclamation to the whole empire about what God had done in King Nebuchadnezzar's life. Belshazzar knew that. And yet he purposely chose not only not to follow that God, but he purposely chose to mock it in utter arrogance. And Daniel says, you knew better. It's an inexcusable act to mock the one in whose hand is our very breath. This is a humbling and challenging story for us in some ways, because how often do we know better, and we still choose to go against what God would have? And sometimes it's more subtle. Personally, there has been so many times I can point to in my life that God has provided in amazing ways, through jobs, through people, bringing the right people into my life when I was, really struggling, providing a job when my job was just ending, I've seen God provide in so many ways. And yet when I hit a time that, I'm not sure about the future, I start to question, God, are you actually there? I don't know if I can trust you. Maybe I have to figure this out for myself because you don't seem to be pulling through. I think Daniel would say, like, you know better. You've experienced what God has done. But it's not only our experience, it's also the word of God. When we say, in our culture, history had its place. We don't really care for it anymore. We're in new technology. We're making advances like crazy. We're focusing on the future. The word of God itself is history. Most of the Bible are stories. They're true stories, yes, but they're narrative. It's history that we are to learn from and is to guide how we live in the future. All of us have personal history. We also have biblical history, and a lot of us have relational history, like Belshazzar, who knew his grandfather and knew his grandfather's testimony and still chose to ignore it. And when we have these insights and we still choose to reject those, Daniel would say we have no excuse. We knew these things. We knew better. Even when we face times when we wonder if God truly cares about us, we know better. I was trying to think of other stories in the Bible that kind of reflect this. And I think who we know of as doubting Thomas is a good representation of this. Thomas is one of the disciples, and the disciples, they traveled with Jesus for several years, probably 3 years. Traveled with him, they saw incredible miracles, feeding the 5,000 out of just a small boy's lunch, raising the dead on multiple occasions. The disciples saw incredible miracles. They heard incredible teachings by Jesus, teachings that included he would die and he would be raised to life. Jesus did die on the cross, as I think we're all familiar with. And he was dead, and the disciples were terrified. They did not know what to do. Suddenly, all that they knew in the past, all they experienced with Jesus kind of seemed to fizzle out, and now they're in the present and wondering, how are we going to get through this? The Romans just killed our leader. They're going to come for us next. And we know after 3 days, Jesus rose from the dead, and he graciously and amazingly started to show himself to various people, most notably the disciples. And yet, as we see, he didn't show himself to all the disciples at once. Out of John 20, verse 24, we can read, "Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came." So this is a previous time Jesus showed himself. "So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe.' 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' And then he said to Thomas, 'Put your fingers here. See my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe.' Thomas answered him, 'My Lord and my God.' Jesus said to him, 'Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe.'" What we see from Jesus is that he is incredibly patient. He's patient with each and every one of us. And yet, there's still an understanding that what we have learned, experienced, read, understood, we are still going to be held accountable for. The greatest example of what God expects us to embrace is the gospel itself, is the historical fact that Jesus walked this earth, died on the cross because there was no way around bringing us back into relationship with him except for a sacrificial lamb to suffer. Jesus was that sacrificial lamb. He took the wrath that we deserved so that if we embrace him, we are forgiven of our sins. That's the greatest truth, the greatest historical fact that we can embrace. And if we choose to reject that, as Belshazzar rejected this fact that Nebuchadnezzar had found the true God, we will be suffering just like he will. We will be held accountable for what God has shown us. And God does hold this king accountable. We see that in the actual interpretation of these verses. Go to verse 24, where Daniel finally gets to the point that the king, has been waiting for this whole time. So what is this vision? Yes, I know the history of my grandfather. He probably doesn't seem to care that much. It's like, what is this vision about? Verse 24, then, this is Daniel continuing, then from his presence, God's presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the manner. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. It's almost a comical ending to this little blip of Belshazzar. Because although he has just had this great party to establish that he's in charge, he's not afraid of anything, he's showing himself as someone really important. God shows up and really gets rid of all those masks, that he is a terrified king that's just trying to hold on to what he can. And after promising these gifts for Daniel, if he can interpret it, he, for one reason or another, he follows through. Maybe he thought if he followed through, he wouldn't receive this punishment. We don't know. But even in this follow through, we see, as we've seen throughout the book of Daniel, that God is still in charge. As the Persians take over, one thing that was known quite well about the Persians is that they didn't just get out with everyone that's in charge. The Persians took out the leader, and they sought to retain all those in authority as best as they could to continue keeping stability in the country, in the empire. And so although Daniel is promoted by this really foolish, arrogant king, we are led to see, and as it goes on in the next chapters, that he retains at least somewhat of his position. So even in this, what appears to be just a humorous last act of this king who promotes the very servant of the God he was just mocking, is still God's hand at work, as Daniel is back in a position of power. He's back in an influential position where he's thriving amongst being in exile. Learning from history is not an option for us, both as Christians, but for the whole world. God's going to hold us accountable, whether it's remembering what God's done in our personal lives and our personal experience, whether it's learning from the Bible, whether it's learning from other people, the truths about God. We are going to be held accountable. And praise be to God that when we fail, Jesus Christ has come that we can be forgiven. If you're a Christian here, this is not supposed to be a downer message because, oh, I messed up and I knew better and therefore I don't deserve God. No, you don't deserve God. And that's the point of Jesus Christ, is he came to give his life so that we could be welcomed into the family of God based on our own merits. But what we see from the book of Daniel is there is still expectation of us to honor God through embracing what he's shown in history. I went through this book a little bit as I was preparing this message, and I think it might be one of the first books I ever underlined. I was always scared to do that. Like I said, textbooks, $150, you want to resell those, right? So I didn't really underline stuff. But this one I did underline, and it didn't start right away because I think I just wanted to get through it. But earlier on, I started to underline and realize, wow, this guy's got a lot to say to myself and our generation as well. This is just one little passage from one of our historians of the past. It says, I wish to bring back to mind my past foulness and the carnal corruptions of my soul. This is not because I love them, but that I may love you, my God. Out of love for your love, I do this. In the bitterness of my remembrance, I tread again my most evilest ways, so that you may grow sweet to me. O sweetness that never fails, O sweetness happy and enduring. Augustine was one that could remember his past. He lived a pretty worldly youth, and he used that to remember just how sweet God was. He looked back to just how dark those days were, to remember how blessed he is to now know God. We are expected to reflect on our past. I'd encourage you this week, reflect on your past, where you came from, what God has shown you. Reflect on the past biblical accounts of the Bible and have that change who you are today. God is still with you just as much as he was back then. I'll invite our worship team to join up here before I close our service.